don't want them to hit someone, so you want to decrease the behavior, and by putting them in timeout, timeout is that additional stimulus, and you hope to decrease them hitting people in the future. Negative punishment, so let's say the child hits someone and you want to take away stimulus, would be like taking away their favorite toy or something. That's negative because it's removing a stimulus, and it's punishment because you don't want them to hit the child, someone else anymore. A really important note is the use of positive reinforcement is always more effective than using any form of punishment. Not only is it more ethical, but it also just works better. For example, if you're training a dog, it's always better to use positive reinforcement than just use punishment. It's not saying punishment is useless, it's not, but positive reinforcement produces effects that last longer and also builds a better rapport with either the dog or the person, and then punishment just is more likely to only create temporary change because it's based on coercion and typically creates a negative relationship with the target. Yeah?
But I think they can use together. For example, as the dog does the right thing, you can praise it, and if the dog does something wrong.
Exactly. So you can use all. So the thing is, behaviorism. When I showed those three branches, they all overlap quite a bit. So with dogs, you can use classical conditioning while using operant and things like that. So for example, I was talking to Professor Zhang, and we both trained our dogs to ring bells before going outside to go pee. So whenever they have to go outside, they ring a bell and they go outside. And we let them out, and so forth. That's classical conditioning, because we would, to train them, it was a little odd, but with my puppy, when they were a puppy, we would ring the bell with their paw, or we would ring the bell in front of them and then take them out. And you do it every single time. If they had to go pee or they just drank water or something, because dogs pee right away, you would ring the bell and you would take them out. And you ring the bell and take them out. So eventually, now that they're a couple years old, they ring the bell themselves, and then we take them out to go to pee. That's classical conditioning. But let's say after every time the dog did it successfully the first time, we're like, oh my God, such a good girl, give them a treat, you did awesome. That's positive reinforcement as well. So they kind of always go hand in hand. That's it. So let's say if you're training a dog, odds are you're going to use a mix of all of these. Probably mostly positive reinforcement, and I'm not sure which punishment, because positive punishment isn't always ethical and all that. But odds are you'll use a mix between reinforcement and punishment, yeah. It's just if you only have to choose one, positive reinforcement is just always works better in the long term, and it's just always more ethical. It's hard to, for example, if you're doing a research study, it's hard to justify punishment, because it's punishment, yeah. So since reinforcement is far more effective, so much research has been conducted on types of reinforcement. So for the most part of the rest of operant conditioning, the rest of the notes will be on types of reinforcement. So what we have is what we call reinforcement schedules or reinforcement scheduling. And we learned that timing of reinforcements is very important. When we give the reinforcement after the behavior is very important. This is a lot of information, and I honestly had to relearn it because it's really confusing. There's just two important distinctions to make. You guys can read this, take a picture, write it down, or I can send it to you guys after. But there are two important distinctions. The first is the difference between continuous and partial. And then the second is the difference between ratio, which are these two, and interval, these two. So continuous and partial. Continuous is that, remember we're doing reinforcement, so we want to increase the behavior occurring in the future. The desired response is reinforced every single time it occurs. So if you use the dog example, the dog rings the bell to go outside, we give them a treat every single time they do it, no matter what. They ring to go outside, we give them a treat. They ring to go outside, we give them a treat, and so forth. Partial, however, is the responses or the behaviors are only sometimes reinforced and sometimes they're not. It's not always, it's not random. So these are kinds of partial reinforcements. So you have a ratio. The ratio schedules focus on giving the reinforcement after a certain number of responses, and the interval ones focus on giving it after a certain amount of time has passed. So that's the biggest distinction, is just knowing continuous versus partial. These are based on how many times it happens, the number of behaviors, and these are based on the amount of time that's passed. So for example, let's say someone's working on a factory line, being paid according to the number of products produced. So let's say you're paid after every 5 things you make on the factory line. That would be an example of what's called a fixed ratio. So it's every 5 you get paid. Variable ratio is a little more random. It's being reinforced after an average but unpredictable number of responses. So there aren't too many great examples of it. So on the factory line, it'd be after a random or unpredictable amount of whatever you've produced. interval is time-based, so fixed interval is monthly salary. Let's say you're paid every single month, you're paid whatever many dollars. That is a fixed interval because every month you're paid the same amount, and it's based on time. Variable interval is also really hard. Like the variable ones are hard to give examples for. There are some here. I wouldn't stress the differences too much. Yeah. Yes.
Just a question. What's the difference between the continuous one and fixed one?
Yeah. So continuous. So these are all fixed ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval are all like subcategories of partial or intermittent reinforcement. Continuous is its own branch. So I did make it perfect. So you have reinforcement schedules, and this is kind of, it's a tough thing to understand. I wanted to kind of make this divide, this tree. So you have continuous reinforcement, it's its own thing. It's reinforcing behavior every single time it happens, no matter what, every single time. And that's why it's its own thing on the left. Partial reinforcement has two kinds, as ratio schedules, which are based on the number of times the behavior occurs, and interval schedules, which is based on time. After a certain number of time, you reinforce the behavior. And you have two kinds, you have fixed interval, and fixed ratio, variable ratio. So that's kind of the difference. Yeah.
So if I'm paid with every copy I make, that's continuous.
Exactly, yeah.
So if I'm paid with every 2 copies I make,
that would be
fixed ratio.
Exactly, fixed ratio. So technically, continuous could be seen as a fixed ratio schedule, for example. And let's say exactly you work at Starbucks or Tim Hortons or something. Every coffee you make, you're paid, let's say, $1 for every single coffee. Well, it's still a fixed ratio. You're still the behavior is still reinforced after a specific number of responses. But when that number happens to be 1, it's continuous. It's every single time.
Continuous is just a special case for the fixed ratio.
Yeah, it can be considered that. We often treat fixed ratio as when it's not 1, so it'd be like paid after every 5 coffees you make, and that's what we consider fixed ratio, but technically you can, like this definition here doesn't outright like remove a ratio of 1, technically. So I guess you can, constitute continuous as a fixed ratio, but often you see it as this divide here where continuous reinforcement is every single 1 time, and fixed ratio is some kind of ratio that's non-equivalent.
Do you think there's a hierarchy of motivation between them?
That's a good question. So I wrote a little note here. Ratio schedules tend to produce a faster and higher rates of responding. So you'll see if you use a ratio schedule, let's say after every 2 coffees you make, you're rewarded, you'd probably be more motivated quicker to make more coffees than if you use an interval schedule. Interval schedules produce slower but more steady rates of responding. So the difference here, interval, since it's time-based, it'll be slower because you'll be essentially rewarded for every coffee you make after a random amount of time. So you won't have the motivation right now to make a ton of coffees because if you make 50 now versus 50 over the span of 2 weeks, you'll probably get rewarded more over the 2 weeks. It's time-based interval schedules. But interval is more rewarding in the long term, so it'll show better changes in the long term. Ratio schedules show more changes in the immediacy, quicker. Yeah, exactly, in the short term. So they show fast and higher rates of responding, yeah. I can send this to you guys as well after. Same thing, it's they're not mutually exclusive either. There's a good chance that these overlap quite a bit. For example, if you have a sales job at a car dealership, if you're paid a monthly salary, but then you're also paid for a certain percentage of every car you sell. While you have a fixed ratio schedule, because you're getting, you have a, fixed interval schedule, because you're getting a monthly salary, but then you're also paid, I don't know where the car sales would fall under, but you're kind of getting a mix of two or more. So then, more on reinforcement, you have a distinction between primary and secondary reinforcers, and this is what I kind of mentioned a little bit before. Primary reinforcers are just any kind of stimuli that are naturally preferred and naturally rewarding to us. So food, water, relief from pain, they're all things that are just naturally we prefer. So in the Pavlov, the dog experience would be food. Secondary reinforcers are just neutral stimuli that has become associated with a primary reinforcer through classical conditioning. So this is the overlap. This is still, reinforcement is still an operant conditioning phenomenon, but when you have a stimuli that's been paired with a primary reinforcer through classical conditioning, it's what we call a secondary reinforcer. So the best example for us is money. If I were to give you a $20 bill, that piece of plastic, or in the States, paper, or in some other places it's coins, has no real value to it, this piece of plastic. That $20 that lets you buy things that are rewarding for you, food, water, other things as well. And money is called a secondary reinforcer. So in the example from Pavlov's experiments, the bell is a secondary reinforcer because it was associated with the food. Yeah?
Where do you think we should classify our morals as?
Morals?
Yeah.
That would be more internally reinforcing. That is actually a really tough question. It's hard to measure morality because it's not. So, for example, traditional behaviorism, which says it doesn't count at all. It's an internal process. It's too subjective to measure. That's traditional behaviorism. More modern behaviorism, we of course now know that it matters your internal thoughts, emotions, and feelings, and all that. But traditionally, it wouldn't have fit into this very much. Yeah, exactly. Since it's too subjective, our morals differ from everyone else's here, and they differ from each other's, and they differ from time to time. My morals now may not be the same morals 10 years from now. Since they're that subjective, traditional behaviorism says we don't measure them. It would really be tough to classify it. I would guess primary reinforcement, but
Because I read that the relief from pain. And
Yeah,
I feel like
exactly.
it's the same sense of your morals. And
it's hard. Like I would consider the primary reinforcement because if you do something against your morals, you feel guilty, and then if you do something with your morals, you don't feel guilty. So
it's kind of like a praise image.
yeah, so that's how I would constitute it as a primary reinforcement. But like very traditional behaviorism, which isn't really practiced anymore, would say it's too subjective to measure. This is the Skinner box. So I think I do have a live example after too, which is kind of neat. It's also been called the operant conditioning chamber. So this is what was created by B.F. Skinner. And it can test a variety of different reinforcers and punishers. The most common, so I found this little picture, the most common example is let's say there's two lights here, there's a speaker, there's a lever, and this is where the food dispenses. They're on a metal grid, so you can also shock the rat. The live example doesn't have that because again, a lot of people don't want to see that. So for example, let's say if the light is green, the rat presses the lever, they're given food. That's an example of a positive reinforcer. They did an action, they press the lever, then they're given food, so that's positive, and you want them to keep pressing that lever, so positive reinforcement. If the light is red, let's say the light's red, rat presses the lever, then the rat is shocked. That is a positive punishment because you're adding that shock stimuli, that electricity, and you don't want the rat to press the button when the light is red. That is not the example that was next, but does that kind of make sense? Negative reinforcement an example of negative reinforcement is, let's say the bottom is constantly electrified. If the rat pressed the button and it removed the electricity, that's negative reinforcement. You're getting rid of that painful, shocking feeling, and they're going to keep pressing that button because they don't want to be shocked. They'll press it and they keep pressing it. Negative punishment would be removing something. Let's say the rat has food already in the cage, they press the button and then the food gets taken away. That's negative punishment. Because you're removing a stimulus, and then the rat will probably not press the button again, or will learn to not press the button again. I want to see if this example works. I don't know if there's sound, but there's a bell. Maybe I can unmute my laptop and hopefully it'll be loud enough. So you'll see it's just a bell sound, and we're able to get in there. You'll see it in a second. So that's the lever, you hear the bell. So in this case, they are doing classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Every time the rat presses that lever, it gets food and it hears a bell. So it's going to associate the lever with the food and as well the bell with the food. So afterwards, let's say you remove the lever, you play the bell sound, the rat should probably go see if there's food. Or will probably. They don't do this example. In this example, it's just positive reinforcement. Every time the rat presses the lever, they get food, so that's positive reinforcement. And you'll see the rat just keeps pressing the lever because it wants food. And it'll just keep going back up. It doesn't stop, it's kind of funny. I think it stops here, so maybe full. Let's keep going. And see it keeps going. So there, I learned positive reinforcement is probably one of the most effective methods, and you can see it picks up really fast. Yeah, and you can do different things, like you can change, this one only has one light up top, but you can turn it on and off and see if the rat will learn differently. I don't know if there's a speaker in this box. A lot of these boxes are used in, not really used much anymore for new research, purely because this is already a well-studied phenomenon. They're used a lot in like, when I went to Sakib Open House, the psych department had a rat, and they did some ethical testing, thankfully, but with running mazes and all that and reinforcement, yeah. I lost my mouse. There it is. Already played. Okay, and then the last section was social learning theory. So this was, I don't want to go back to the timeline, but it was in 1977, I don't want to say, but Albert Bandura was a psychologist who published what he called social learning theory and was later called social cognitive theory. It's still called SLT for the most part. Bandura wanted to propose that learning could occur through observation as well. That not only can occur through association of stimuli or the association of behavior and its consequence, but he thought that we could learn from simply observing, imitating, and modeling someone else's behavior. Yeah.
So it's only applied for the human or just any animals?
This applies to pretty much all animals as well. It's most best understood in humans is, let's say I play baseball in the summer, and let's say Morteza wants to learn how to play baseball. If he watches me swing a bat 100 times, he'll eventually learn, okay, well Nick he puts his foot here, he does this, and Morteza will be able to learn to swing a bat. And so that's an example of learning in humans. It's also been done in monkeys and all that. I have some examples somewhere, I'm not sure where exactly. Oh, I discussed the next slide is, each of these kind of has one famous study done with them. For classical conditioning, it was both Pavlov and little Albert. In operant conditioning, it was with the Skinner box and rats. And with this one's called the Bobo doll study, and I'll show you it, it's quite literally the next slide, which is pretty neat. It's mostly done in humans, but it has been done in animals as well. Is when an animal sees, for example, I actually have 2 dogs. When the younger one saw the older one ring the bells to go out, she also learns to ring the bells to go out because she's modeling the older dog's behavior. It's a little bit harder to realize because it's not like I can ask my younger dog if she's following my older dog. You can do that in humans, at least in adult humans. It's harder to do in kids because they might lie or they might not be aware of it. But yes, Bandura proposed that we can learn through observation, imitation, and modeling. His theory acts as a bridge between a traditional behaviorist view and a more modern cognitive approaches because it does take into account some internal processes. One of the biggest critiques is that it's not enough, but it does count for some. So remember that a traditional behaviorist would say that our internal processes are too subjective to be studied. But Bandura said that those internal mental processes mediate our learning process. So they have some effect on how well and how much we can learn. And then reinforcement does not always come from outside sources. Reinforcement can be internal, like you said, morals, or you can just be proud of yourself. If you worked really hard to accomplish something and then you accomplish it, you're gonna feel good. According to traditional behaviorism, classical and operant conditioning, that doesn't count. But it does. It showed that you put in the hard work and you accomplish something and you're proud of yourself, then you're more likely to put in that hard work in the future. Yes, so Bandura took into account some of those internal mental states. So an important definition for the next part is the term model. In this case, a model refers to a person whose behavior is being observed and imitated. So like Morteza, I use an example, sorry Morteza. But if Morteza's trying to learn how to swing a bat from me, then I'd be the model. Morteza's trying to learn from me, or vice versa if I'm trying to learn from Morteza. This is the person we're trying to learn from. So Bandura identified 4 internal mediational processes that play a role in how well someone is able to imitate a model's behavior. And we have, as we have them written here, the first is attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. So attention is the requirement that the model must capture the observer's interest and attention. I'm gonna keep going back to Morteza, I'm sorry, but if Morteza has no interest in learning how to swing a bat, then obviously he's not gonna learn how to swing a bat from me because he has no interest in doing so. You have to take the attention as if, let's say someone's dozing off and they're not paying attention, then they won't learn. Retention refers to the observer's ability to retain and store information provided by the model. So very simply put, it's how well the observer can remember the components of the behavior. So back like the batting example, okay, if I step, how well can whoever's learning from me remember that I stepped? Okay, I have my arms up here, I swung, this or that. You have to remember each kind of component of the behavior. It applies to also to behaviors that aren't as like physically demanding. Reproduction is the physical ability, how well the person can actually perform the behavior that the model has demonstrated. For example, if I want to learn gymnastics and I'm watching an Olympic gymnast, the odds are is I probably can't do what they can do. So even if I'm paying attention, even if I have the ability to remember every small detail they do, I probably can't reproduce it just because I'm not flexible. I can't do half the stuff they physically can do. And lastly is motivation, which is just defined as our will to learn the behavior. It's a key role. And operant conditioning can play a role here as well in motivation or in all of these really. Yeah.
So what's the precise difference between attention and motivation?
So motivation, attention would be. That's a good question. So motivation is, for example, if I really want to learn gymnastics, that would be my motivation. Is that I have a really big interest in it, and then I pull up a YouTube video of the 2022 gymnastics competition, something like that. Attention would be, let's say, watching that video, I get really easily distracted. I get an email, I get a phone call, I go play some game with my family. That would be attention. If I'm easily distracted, I'm not paying attention to it. They go hand in hand. They're not exclusive. So like if I'm really motivated to learn something, the odds are I'll probably attend to it. I'll direct my attention there. But it's not always the case. For example, if I'm learning calculus 3, my motivation is that I want to pass the class because I don't want to fail and I want to get through university. However, the prof is this really old guy and he just talks monotone like this and doesn't say anything else and just keeps pointing about, and it's really boring. Well, I'm probably to lose my attention at some point. So I'm motivated to learn calculus 3. I don't think it's like the most interesting thing in the world, but I'm motivated because I have to pass the class. And then I kind of lose my attention. Retention would be my ability to remember, okay, here's the derivative of this, integral of that, and so forth, all the formulas. And reproduction would be my ability to, I guess, write in this case, which should be good, and then be able to reproduce the information that I have retained. Does that make sense so far? So this is the Bobo doll experiment. I took pictures. This is the pictures from it. So a few years before he published his social learning theory, Bandura conducted a now famous experiment called the Bobo doll study, or the Bobo doll experiment. The sample consisted of preschoolers that were divided into 3 groups. So one group observed aggressive adult behavior model. So a Bobo doll is this like stand-up inflatable doll that I think it kind of looks like a bowling pin, honestly, but it stands up, and if you were to like push it over, it would kind of pop back up. And that's what a Bobo doll is. I mean, you can see it kind of here clear. And there's 3 groups of preschoolers. So one group observed adults perform some kind of aggressive act on the Bobo doll, either hitting it, punching it, kicking it, throwing it across the room. Another group observed non-aggressive behaviors. So they would see the person just sit with the Bobo doll, maybe give them a hug. And the third group was not exposed to kind of any behavior with the Bobo doll. There are other toys in the room. They're not clear by these pictures. You can't really tell. But there are other toys in the room, so that third group was our control group where the adults just wanted to go play with some other toy and they left the Bobo doll there. The idea there is to see which child or which children produce what kind of behaviors. So in order to control for gender differences, the groups were then divided by gender, and half of each gender group would observe same-sex behavior and opposite-sex behavior. So the idea was maybe young boys see older men hitting the Bobo doll. Are they more likely to hit the Bobo doll than young girls seeing men hit the Bobo doll? And they kind of control for gender in that way. Yeah, so after observing the model interact with the Bobo doll, the kids were then given an opportunity to do the same. So they either saw the model interact with the Bobo doll aggressively or non-aggressively or not at all, playing with some other toys, and kids were put in that room afterwards as well. Not really surprisingly, the kids who observed adults abuse, hit, punch the Bobo doll did the same when given the opportunity. It's kind of a funny study to watch because you just see kids beating up this inflatable doll. Then in all 3, so note that on all 3 conditions, the kids had other toys in the room yet and did not have to play with the Bobo doll. The study yielded similar results across genders. There were some differences though, depending on the degree to which the behavior was sex typed. Because that's the term what we use in psych just to refer to how much the behavior is viewed as stereotypically male or female. So for example, males were somewhat more prone to imitate physical aggression because physical aggression is a masculine typed behavior. We more often stereotypically associate physical aggression with men than we do with women. So the young boys, the preschoolers, the male preschoolers in the study were more likely to replicate physical aggression than were girls. That doesn't mean girls were not at all likely, they still were more likely had they viewed it, but boys were just statistically far more likely. And there are no differences in the imitation of verbal aggression, for example, which isn't necessarily sex type, compared to male and female. I kind of explained it a little poorly, but does that study make sense? This is the big experiment for social living theory. Yeah.
What's the result for the control group?
Yeah. So it was mostly kind of what you would expect. So the group that, comparing the groups within, to each other, the group that observed aggressive behavior were far more likely than both other groups to replicate the aggressive behavior. The group that saw non-aggressive behavior interacted with the boba doll in a very similar way, non-aggressively. They treated it very similar to how the adults did, either just by being indifferent to it or hugging it, something like that. And the last one too was just the adults played with other toys in the room that were not the boba doll, and the kids did the same thing. They maybe played with the boba doll, but it would be in no different way than the other group, yeah.
So the kids just didn't play with the boba doll?
Yeah, exactly. So the last group, the third group, that were exposed to kind of any behavior, they might have played with the boba doll, but no more like statistical difference than playing with any other toy. Right, because let's say there's 25 toys in the room and one of them is the boba doll, there's still a chance a kid goes in and plays with the giant inflatable. Yeah.
Because I was wondering if naturally, what would the kid perform?
Yes, that's it. So the third group.
Will they be more aggressive or?
The third group was our control. So I'm not 100% sure if they exhibit like. That was kind of our baseline. I mean, let's say that the boba doll is the biggest toy in there, then the kid probably has some tendency to go towards the biggest toy. So since the third group acted as our control, we can't really like compare it to anything else. But the third group, they didn't witness any kind of interaction with the boba doll. They didn't show any kind of like natural, air quotes, aggressive behavior with the boba doll. They may have played with it, but it wasn't like anything different than expected. So these are some applications. We kind of went over this. So now that we know what negative reinforcement is, we can go back to the fear conditioning one. So if we use the example of Joe again, so he gets bitten, unconditioned stimulus, it hurts the bite, which is the unconditioned response. Let's say Joe is walking down the street one day, he sees a dog, and it gives him this anxious feeling, he gets scared a little bit. So that seeing the dog is the conditioned stimulus, that scared, anxious feeling is the conditioned response. And let's say, just as Joe's walking down the street, he's scared of the dog, he crosses to the other side of the street. That's an example of negative reinforcement. The fact that he crossed the street, it gets rid of his anxious feeling because he's no longer close to the dog. And that getting rid of the anxious feeling is negative, and it's going to increase the likelihood that he crosses the street again because it's reinforcing. It's like getting rid of that headache. It's a negative reinforcement. And that's how fear conditioning works. That's the biggest, one of the biggest applications of behaviorism. Is, let's say, phobias. People who are scared of spiders. Like, for example, I have a fear of spiders. It's not clinically distressing, so I don't have to go through exposure therapy. If there's a spider on this wall, I'd be fine to keep talking. It wouldn't distract me too much. So for example, in very extreme cases, some people have an inordinate fear of just going outdoors. They're worried lightning's going to strike them. They're worried they're going to get hit by a car or something like that. Something that seems crazy to us, but to them, they've worked up in their head that it's possible. So that would be something that's obviously a clinical impairment, and that's where you do use the clinical application of fear exposure and all that. You would slowly work up to it. An example would be, let's say someone has to plan something down to every minute. They have to plan the detail of everything they do, because if they don't, they worry something might go wrong. Well then, if they plan everything down to the exact minute and nothing goes wrong, they're going to think, oh, thank God I planned everything, nothing went wrong because I planned everything, and that's negative reinforcement. Their anxiety at the end goes away because they planned everything or because they think they planned everything, and that kind of keeps it going. In the future, they're more likely to plan everything down to the minute again. So you can kind of catch yourself doing some things like this too. This negative reinforcement behavior is, let's say you have a fear of public speaking. For example, I could have emailed Tiandi this morning and be like, sorry, I can't come in, I'm not feeling well. And that would get rid of my anxiety about public speaking. But then by being here, by presenting and all that, it kind of exposure therapy is like, get over my fear of public speaking and stuff like that. Some critiques. So arguably the biggest critique of behaviorism, or more so traditional behaviorism, is that it does not account for internal mental processes. Although Bandura's social learning theory does cover some internal processes, those four: attention, retention, motivation, and I don't remember the last one. Some argue that it doesn't account for enough. Another critique is that behaviorism may place an overemphasis on observation. This has been long-standing clash between nature and nurture. So the idea that are we born with a tendency towards certain behaviors or do we learn them? This is actually very, the nature versus nurture dilemma is very discussed in psych. It's a very big issue. So in general, describing behavior solely in those terms, if behavior is solely nature or solely nurture, is very limiting. And most modern perspectives, actually I think all modern perspectives, or all legitimate modern perspectives, assume that behavior, or most human traits in general, are a mix between the two. That we have some kind of genetic predisposition towards a behavior, and that we learn through the environment, which is nurture, through operant and classical and social learning theory, we learn more about that behavior, whether or not we should do more or less of it. Yeah. Exactly. So most modern perspectives have that kind of interdisciplinary view of nature and nurture. And this also applies to genetics and all that. It's a little more out of the scope of behavioral psych, but yes. So if I send this to you guys, I also included some references of, I didn't want to use articles, I wanted to use websites that explained it in a little more easier to digest sense. So sites like Very Well Mind has some pretty good examples. So this is if you want to learn more about the little Albert experiment. This one's just like a general overview. I had given Xiaomi, I had given you one of these here, this one here. This is a textbook from BC campus. So it's meant for like Albert and all, but it's very good. It kind of goes over, its 8th chapter specifically is about, it's called learning. Behavioral psych is often also just called learning, because the premise is, most of its application is how we learn behaviors and all that, and how we learn from behaviors. But yeah, that's the premise of, I think that's right. Well, let me check. Yeah, that's the link. Whoopsies. Oh, hope you have anything else after this. No, I don't. Okay. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
So I was wondering, what if I pay you for you to touch a spider?
If you pay me for
You to touch a spider.
teach us better.
Touch a spider.
Touch a spider.
Touch a spider. Okay.
So meaning that reinforcement happen together with punishment.
So, for example, let's say, let's say I have a fear of spiders. That's an example. Let's say a spider appears in this wall. If you were to pay me to touch the spider, let's see, it would be a mix of a few things. So, the thing is, I know odds are you're probably not going to pay me again to touch the spider next week, let's say. So it is a form of positive reinforcement. That being said, like if I see a spider tomorrow, I'm not going to go ahead and touch and be like, "Where's my $20?" Because I'm human and I can have that like metacognitive ability of realizing that, like, let's say I go home tonight. Let's say I do it right now. If a spider gives me $20, I go home tonight. I'm not going to touch a spider waiting for someone to give me $20 because I know that's not how that works. If it's like a dog, for example, you see sometimes on social media dogs press these buttons to like speak with humans, and odds are they use positive reinforcement to get them to do that. So animals that like lack that metacognitive ability, yes, maybe. Ideally, I probably don't. So if I were to do it right now, it would be positive reinforcement. Whether it's effective, it's probably not effective because I probably won't touch a spider again. That's a little bit different because that's kind of like an incentive for me to do it. If I have a fear though, it'll still have that exposure effect. So let's say I do have a really bad fear of spiders and I were to get close to it or even touch it. Touching it right out the gate if you have a bad fear is like a big step. But that still would act as exposure therapy regardless of the incentive to do so. Yes.
So my question was, I was curious, because most of our behaviors are a mixture of punishment and reinforcement.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Yeah,
So I was
so
wondering which one is the leading place. For example, if I want to train myself, I need to endure the boringness or the pain or tiredness.
yeah, so one doesn't necessarily have like in terms of, I can go all the way back. In terms of operant conditioning, the biggest one is positive reinforcement. However, when comparing operant and classical conditioning, you're kind of comparing the expressions apples and oranges. Like they're similar, apples and oranges, they're both fruits, but they're not the exact same thing. So it's not like one takes precedent over the other. Like if you wanted to train yourself to do something, The best combination is probably a mix between classical and operant conditioning. Odds are classical and positive reinforcement. For example, if I'm studying for finals, I had one day I'm studying for finals, I spent 7 hours in a Starbucks studying. And my positive reinforcement was spending $7 on a coffee that probably shouldn't have cost me $7. And that's my positive reinforcement. I know that if I go to a Starbucks, I'm gonna spend probably twice the price of a coffee I should probably spend on, but I'm gonna get 7 or 6 hours, 7 hours of studying done. And that's my positive reinforcement to keep doing that. So during finals, I know I gotta work hard, that's my motivation, social learning theory. And so that means I go to a Starbucks, I am reinforcing my studying behavior by buying myself something I enjoy, something like that, yeah. Does that make sense?
So yeah, so both the assume that each event is individual, and it's not a mixture of punishment and reinforcement. It's either punishment or
yes, exactly. So punishment and reinforcement are exclusive to themselves. You either the distinction lies on if you want to increase the behavior from occurring again in the future. For example, I want to study more for finals. Well, that's tough because I don't want to study more for finals. I don't want to study at all. But I know that if I have to do well, I got to convince myself to study.
So actually, it's a budget of all the calculations down.
Sorry?
So it's a result for the budget.
Yes, exactly.
It's everything.
So you tend to inform what you're going to do based off of if you want to increase or decrease it. But in reality, for example, you don't necessarily want to take Advil to reduce pain from headache every single time you have a headache. It's not something like you want to do.
Yeah, that's
but
very
it is reinforcing because you're getting rid of that pain. It's reinforcing the behavior. You don't necessarily want to, but it is. So all
what is causing me stomach pain?
Sorry?
What is Advil is causing me stomach pain?
If the Advil is, that's a different story. So if the Advil is causing some kind of reaction with you, then that is positive punishment, right?
Positive punishment plus negative reinforcement.
It would be, so then you would have to weigh what is better and what is worse. Is the stomach pain worth getting rid of the headache, or do you rather the headache over the stomach pain?
Okay, so after all, I have to calculate everything and then the result.
Yes, there's also, the thing is, since we're humans, we have a higher level of thinking than animals. For example, a dog, if you present them with Advil and Tylenol, and let's say Advil has a bad reaction with them, they're not going to be able to think that Advil has a bad reaction with me, able to take Tylenol instead. We do, right? So if you have a bad reaction to Advil, you can take Tylenol, you can take, I don't know the other drugs off the top of my head, but there's other drugs you can, over-the-counter medication as well, you can take to help the headache as well. So odds are, if you take Advil, you have a bad reaction, you probably won't take it again, and then you'll take something else. This is also a bit of classical conditioning, is let's say you take Advil for the first time, tomorrow, you have a bad reaction, you're gonna be like, oh, it was the Advil, and then you're not gonna touch Advil again, because you don't wanna have that bad reaction. Even if it was, let's say, something else you ate, you might just think it's the Advil, and you just made that association between that negative feeling, bad feeling, I shouldn't use the word negative, that sick feeling and Advil, so that's the association between the two, and then you'll probably take Advil less in the future. And that is itself negatively reinforcing, because you don't take it, you avoid the bad feeling, and then it's reinforcing, because it'll increase the chance of you not taking Advil. It's kind of, when you really get into it, like a lot of double negatives in this and that, so it's a little tricky.
Okay.
Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think this conclusion about the positive reinforcement is larger than the punishment. It is objective conclusion, or it's just from the
Yes, it is objective. Just first off, ethically speaking, you should always use punishment over reinforcement, but it is objective. The reason why is, well, there's two reasons. The first one is that it establishes a better relationship with, if you're conditioning a person, they're more aware of their thoughts and feelings because they're human, but even with a dog and all that, it establishes a better rapport and relationship with the dog. If you were to constantly punish a dog, for example, the odds are the dog's not going to like you. Same thing with people. If you were to constantly punish a person, for example, if I was a teacher and I were to constantly punish my students instead of reinforcing it, they probably won't like me. So punishment does work. It doesn't say it doesn't. It's not that it doesn't work, but punishment works less in the long term. For example, if I'm a teacher, I'm trying to teach my students not to talk too much in class. If I keep punishing them when they do, odds are when they have another teacher, they're just gonna keep talking in class. They know not to do it around me, but they'll do it around other people. Well, let's say you guys are all quiet now. Let's say, oh, I noticed my students are all quiet. I don't give them chocolate. We can play a fun game. I can dismiss them 10 minutes early and give them a reward. Then they're more likely to do that in the long term with other teachers and all that too. So there's that kind of generalizability as well. So they're not all like exclusive, and it really depends. So positive reinforcement or reinforcement in general tends to be used Moreover, it's hard to do like negative reinforcement in a classroom setting, for example. I mean, I guess dismissing from class early could be negative reinforcement, but it's a lot less obvious. That's why we say positive reinforcement over punishment, but technically negative reinforcement should work just as well. Yeah.
Yeah, right. From the, if you want to get a harmony environment outcome, think about the long term.
Yeah, long-term punishment is always more stable than reinforcement is always more stable than punishment. And if you get into the reinforcement schedules, you can see, like, let's say you want to produce a very fast rate of responding right away, then you should use like a ratio schedule. And if you want to do it more stable in the long term, like in a year or something from now, then you use interval schedules and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you just consider the result of the training speed or the effect, I think the punishment may be more effective. Yeah, for example, if you are training a tiger instead of dog, if you're training the lion or the tiger's performance, even if they always use the punishment, and because the fairness driven is much more strong than the bonus. You know.
Yes. So I mean, I would be wary of aggravating a tiger, but the
tiger must be fair to you.
Yes. So the premise is, yeah, you're not if you care about like the immediacy, like within a day you want to change a behavior, punishment may work better. However, it depends on a few things. For example, if you want to increase a behavior, let's say you want to have this tiger stand on its back legs, it's hard to use punishment to get that behavior to happen, because naturally the tiger's on its four legs. Like you can't just you can't keep punishing it until it stands on its back legs. Like it's not going to understand that it has to stand up. But when it does, reinforcing it would work better. So it just depends on what behavior you're targeting and if you want to increase it or decrease it. Because if you want, let's say the tiger stands on its back legs, you can't just like shock it and shock it and shock it and shock it. It's not going to know what to do.
Use a stiff attack.
Yeah, but it's not. The thing is, it's not going to understand that. Okay, this person wants me to stand up on my back legs. Once it does stand up on its back legs, then you can give it reinforcement, and then eventually, with enough time, the thing is, it's a rare phenomenon for tigers to stand on their back legs, so it'd be hard to do it. But once they do it once, you give them food. They do it again, you give them food, and eventually, so there you kind of have to use reinforcement. You wouldn't be able to use punishment. But for example, if students talking in class, that's a pretty normal occurrence. There you could use punishment. There's other considerations there. For example, you can't hit your students anymore, at least. So some forms of punishment are off the table, but you can use punishment there. Like if your kids are being extra disruptive, you can assign more homework. That's a form of positive punishment. Again, it's not saying that punishment can work, it can. Whether or not it's ethical is questionable.
Yeah, and also for our law, I think that restrict people for the punishment because people don't want to break the law if they are being punished.
Yeah, so in research in general, that's why the vast majority of research focuses on reinforcement. It's hard to nowadays justify punishment. Back then, you had all sorts of crazy experiments in psych. So little Albert's like the tip of the iceberg. That was unethical. And they didn't like, one of the reasons it's so unethical is because they didn't extinction. I don't know how to conjugate the word extinction. Extinguish, I guess, the fears that Albert had. After it was done, they just like let him go home, which is even more unethical. But there's a whole other, within like the early 1900s, mid 1900s, ethics in psychology is honestly like a more recent development. Like you could really go down the rabbit hole of some really unethical research that we've learned a lot of cool things from, but we'd never be able to do again. There's like a Stanford prison experiment where they locked students in like a mock prison. They gave half the powers of guards and half prisoners, and they wanted to see if the guards would abuse their powers.
Is this a real story?
Yeah, yeah. There's some really crazy experiments. There's that.
It's very famous.
Yeah, that's one of the most famous ones. They want to see if the students who were given the power of guards would abuse their powers, and like kind of humiliate the students who were given the prisoner roles, and sure enough they did. And it went on for a little bit. There's some really, there's some big ones. I can't think of any on the top of my head, but there's some like really big and unethical studies that we've learned a lot from in the past. There's another one where we made participant, well not we, other psychologists made participants think they shocked and killed a man. I don't remember the name of the study right now, but it was, I don't remember his name. Do you remember it?
I read the I think this experiment.
Oh, it's very famous.
This one of the famous books. slow and fast thinking about if you let the person's.
It was, oh, I don't remember the name of the experiment, but there was another experiment where, yeah, we had participants come in, other people had participants come in and pretend to shock another participant, we told them. It was actually a term we refer to them as a confederate. It's someone who's in on the study. So for example, I've actually acted as a confederate once too, where we tell the participant that this person is also a participant, but they're not, we're lying to them. So it's kind of, you need to be like a good actor. But so we had, back in 1950 something, there was a study, Milgram, the Stanley Milgram experiment. Here, let me Google it. I will show you guys. Oh, where's my?
Interesting.
One of the, yeah, exactly. So they had, I don't know the pictures. This again has nothing to do with behavioral psych, but it's really interesting. It kind of does. You would have this, you would have someone called the teacher. This would be the real participant, and then you would have this person we told the participant was another participant, but they're not, they're in on it. And you'd have the experimenter. So the experimenter would have the participant to read questions to the learner, and the learner would purposely get some questions wrong. It would be like math questions, other questions, and every time the learner got a question wrong, the participant had to shock the learner. In reality, they didn't actually shock the learner. Since this person's in on it, it was fake, but they were a paid actor, and they actually were like a good actor. So they were constantly increased the voltage. It was in a box that looked like this. And there was clear markings on the box about how much a person could take shock-wise, and there's a skull and crossbones, and eventually the person would get enough questions wrong, and the experimenter would tell the participant to keep upping the shock level, and we would see how many people would go over that line of where it says do not cross, essentially. And like 90-something% of people did, and everyone was like, no, I won't, and then most people did, and it was to study the idea of how people will follow authority figures, even if it's as simple of just as a random researcher. This has nothing to do with behavioral psych. I didn't plan on discussing this, but it's a very interesting study. And at one point, the learner faked being dead, and that's the biggest unethical part, is that people think they killed men, and that would never fly. In psych experiments now, we're not allowed to cause any kind of psychological distress. And this is psychological distress, realizing that you probably killed someone. So it's probably not great, and I would never fly again. Yeah, this is called the Milgram experiment, yeah. And it has some interesting applications too, but all that. All right, that was a sidetrack. Any other questions? We good? Yeah, go for it.
What's the difference between negative reinforcement and positive punishment?
Yeah, so, let me drag this down here so you guys don't see my notes. Okay, so negative reinforcement and positive punishment. Let me full screen this thing, roll it up. Okay, no, that's a good question. Negative reinforcement and positive punishment. Okay, so the difference between reinforcement and punishment, so the biggest, when dealing with positive, these are like the terms here. You always want to look at either if it's punishment or reinforcement first. So punishment is decreasing the behavior from occurring. You want it to happen less. Well, you don't want it to happen less, but it's going to happen less. Reinforcement actually is the opposite, is you want that behavior to happen more. So, for example, if a kid's studying, and you want them to keep studying or study more often, then you would reinforce that behavior. So don't worry about positive and negative, you just reinforce that behavior. If you have a kid and that kid hits someone, you don't want them to do that in the future, so you have to punish that behavior so it doesn't happen in the future. I mean, you don't have to punish it, but that would be the example of the difference between negative punishment and reinforcement. You said negative reinforcement and positive punishment, right? Okay, so positive punishment is easier to conceptualize, as it's kind of way back, I like to say way back when, but for example, if a student talks out of line and the teacher hits the student, that is positive punishment. So positive in the sense that we're adding a stimulus, that hitting the student is positive. It's not good, but it's positive. It's an adding a stimulus. And we're punishing the student because we don't want them to talk again in the future without raising their hand.
Okay.
So the example here is, let's say I have a kid, they're in grade 1, they hit someone else, I don't want them to hit anyone else, so I'm gonna put them in timeout. They're gonna go in timeout for 10 minutes in the corner. So putting them in timeout is the addition of a stimulus. You're adding something and you want them to not hit anyone else in the future, so that's punishment. Negative reinforcement is by far the hardest one to understand. This example here isn't like great, but it kind of makes sense. So the negative reinforcement we did it with fear conditioning, with the dog bite. So for example, Joe, the guy I used at the end there, he's scared of dogs. If, let's say he's walking down the street, downtown Montreal, he sees a dog walking on the same side of the street as him, he gets scared, so he walks to the other side of the street, he crosses the street. And then he's no longer scared. He's like, okay, I avoided the dog, I'm better now, I'm less scared, less anxious. That's negatively reinforcing. So you don't like feeling anxious, nobody does. Joe doesn't like it either, he doesn't like feeling scared. By crossing the street, he gets rid of that scared feeling. So that means in the future, he's more likely to cross the street and get rid of that scared feeling. Because why would he walk on the side of the street and feel scared with the dog when he can cross and not feel scared? That's kind of like the logic. You don't always realize it. For example, I've been studying this for like 4 years, so I notice when I'm negatively reinforcing my own behavior. Not always, it slips quite a bit, but it's not like always an explicit thought process. Like when Joe crosses the street, he's probably not thinking, oh, this is a negatively reinforcing behavior. He's probably just crossing the street to get rid of the feeling. Like for example, if you have a headache and you take Advil, you don't think, oh, this is negatively reinforcing. You're just taking the Advil because you don't want the headache anymore. But odds are in the future, you'll keep taking Advil to get rid of any headache you have. Is that kind of?
So positive punishment is purely for education?
Well, positive punishment, so these can be used in like all sorts of fields. They're not like exclusive to any. I'm trying to think of some other positive punishment examples. Most of mine involve hitting, unfortunately. Yeah, it would be.
It can be for education.
Yeah, well, all these can be used in education. That's it. So a lot of. I spent my first year in university in the faculty of education. So a lot of what you learn to, I don't want to say train students. Doesn't sound good, but to teach students and all that is through mostly reinforcement. Some old school teachers have some punishment tactics, but it's really through reinforcement. Let's say you're trying to teach math to a kid. I was in education to teach math. If you want to teach math to a kid, the best way of doing it is to reinforce the behaviors. So I also tutor, for example. Let's say I'm tutoring a topic the kid who is struggling with. They get a question right. Just giving them praise, for example, saying like, you did awesome, it was a great question, that was a hard question, you figured it out, that's great. That's positive reinforcement, because I'm adding praise. It's hard to conceptualize negative reinforcement in that sense. Let's say I give them 10 questions, and I do so well on the first one, like, you know what, you don't have to do the last one. That's kind of negative reinforcement, because I'm removing a stimulus. It's a little bit hard to conceptualize that, but we taking something they don't like away. That's negative reinforcement. So it's easiest to like picture them in educational settings, but like they can be used anywhere. They're not exclusive to education. They're not, for example, the negative reinforcement with Joe and the dog crossing the street. A lot of them have clinical applications. I'm trying to think of the clinical application for schizophrenia. Oh, positive reinforcement and depression are associated with each other. Depression is associated with a decrease in positive reinforcement. So people who do less things that make them happy tend to be more depressed. And to get them less depressed, we tell them to go do things that make them happy. It's a very like crude way of breaking it down. It's a little more advanced than that, but that's the premise. Is if someone's feeling sad, we'll tell them like, go do something that you enjoy, that you find rewarding. Go hang out with friends. Go see a movie if you like to see movies. Go do something you enjoy. And then you kind of, in clinical applications even more. Yeah, that's positive reinforcement, exactly. So there's like treatments.
Decrease their step.
So let's say, sorry?
In that example, people add some stimulus to decrease their.
So adding a stimulus to decrease the behavior would be positive punishment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why that example is positive?
For depression, or
Yeah.
that would be positive reinforcement is doing things they enjoy. So if that's a little bit outside the scope of behavioral psych and behaviorism, but if a person does a theory of depression that if someone essentially does less things that are rewarding to them, they become sadder and ultimately develop depression. So that's not a focus on like punishment or reinforcement. It's just let's say every week I go out every Friday night and I get dinner with friends. If I stop seeing my friends, for example, let's say friends are a big part of my life, I love hanging out with people, I love talking to people. If I stop seeing them, then that'll make me sadder, and let's say I have depression after that. Don't focus on like reinforcement or punishment there. That's just like missing or a lack of positive reinforcement. And let's say go see a psychologist, the first thing he'll probably tell me is, go hang out with friends, go do something you enjoy, go play baseball, go, I don't know, do a hobby, something like that. Walk your dog, play with your dog, something like that. And that would be increasing positive reinforcements. So now it's like kind of, we're beyond the scope, so it's like you can positively reinforce a behavior, but then positive reinforcement is also like a behavior itself. So you want to like increase the amount of positive reinforcements you have.
So the quality and the punishment, the scope of the behavior is for the intervention behavior, not the
Yes, so
itself.
for example, since we're doing procrastination research, if we want to get people to procrastinate less, well, that less means punishment of some sort, and we can then kind of choose whether it be negative or positive. So let's say every time someone procrastinates, we spray them with water. They don't like being sprayed with water. Kind of things like a dog training. So they procrastinate, psh, water spray. Procrastinate, psh, water spray. So then they'll eventually, through classical conditioning as well, associate procrastinating and water spray. And then ideally they'll procrastinate less because it's positively punishing to get sprayed with water. So that's the example of in procrastination. Like you can also negatively punish. I'm trying to think of someone procrastinates, we take their phone away. They like their phone, presumably. We take their phone away, that's negatively punishing because they like their phone and we're removing it from them. So in this case, like taking a kid's toy away, yeah, that would be negative punishment. So if you want to get people to procrastinate more, then you move up to the reinforcement category, and then they procrastinate, we're like, great, here's chocolate, that would be positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement in procrastination, it's kind of hard. I can't think of an example. Hold up, someone's procrastinating, you have to take away something they don't like. I don't know, let's say someone procrastinates, you take away the work they don't want to do. Well, that's negatively reinforcing. They learned that procrastination means they don't have to do the work, so then they procrastinate and don't do the work. Yeah. Yeah.
So the classical conditioning and the operant conditioning both are belong to the intervention method?
It's possible. It really, so that depends on like what kind of behaviors you're dealing with and what you want to incorporate, what can be incorporated. Like it's operant is focused on like the behavior and its consequence, and classical is more so associating like two stimuli that aren't necessarily linked together. So in the
Yeah, this is my next question. What's the most difference between these two?
yeah, so for example in this Skinner box here. So the rat presses the lever and then gets food. So ignoring the sound, the rat presses the lever and gets food in this corner here. That is operant conditioning. They learn when they press that lever, they get food. So that's positive reinforcement, right? The food is the addition of stimulus, and they're going to keep pressing the lever because they want food. They like food, supposedly. The bell in the background you hear, when he presses or it presses the lever, give it a second. You hear that little bell? You hear that little thing? So that is classical conditioning. Well, it's a little bit of both. The bell isn't like rewarding to the rat in any way. It's also not punishing to the rat. Hopefully it's not hurting the rat. But the idea is, let's say you take away this lever, and then you play the bell sound, the rat will probably go check if there's food there because it's just learned to associate that bell with the food. So it's also associating the lever press with the bell. So if you ring the bell, maybe the rat will go press the lever, but odds are if you ring the bell, it'll go check if there's food because it's just associated the bell and food. And it's also associated the lever press with food, but that's a behavior and its consequences. So there's operant conditioning between the lever and food, and there's classical conditioning between the bell, there's no like bell here, but bell and food. That kind of makes sense? Because the rat doesn't realize it's ringing the bell as well. Presumably, if it does, then it's a really smart rat. So it's just associating the neutral stimulus of the bell at first with the unconditioned stimulus of the food. It's a little bit tricky, I know. It's a lot of terms between both. It's a lot to learn. Yeah.
I think the example about the positive punishment and the negative punishment is reverse this rule.
For,
Yeah, because
oh, I'll go back.
because here from my knowledge,
Where's my mouse? Yeah.
yeah, mostly negative punishment and positive punishment, both of them are trying to reduce the bad behavior.
Yes.
But the negative punishment is mostly remove
Something they like.
yeah, remove some bonus, yeah, positive stimulation, and the positive punishment is to add some negative stimulation.
Yeah, so it's hard.
So take the toy is the positive punishment.
Taking the toy is negative punishment. So it's hard because you don't want to use the term positive and negative to refer to the stimulus itself. Like, for example, if a kid really likes a toy, you can say the toy is positive, but we try not to because positive in the toy sense and positive over here mean two different things, right? A toy being positive and positive punishment is like adding something. They're two different definitions of the same term. So we try not to say like the toy is positive. Or for example, if we put the child in timeout, the timeout is technically positive. Obviously the kid doesn't like it, so you can say it's negative to the kid, but the timeout is the addition of a stimulus, which is positive. So we try not to use the term positive and negative to refer to the stimuli themselves. We try and use it to refer to like punishments and reinforcement types. So since the kid enjoys the kid's toy, presumably the kid likes the toy, if you take away that toy, you're taking away a stimulus, that means it's negative, at least. Since you're decreasing the behavior from occurring, that's what makes it punishment. If the kid doesn't like the toy, you take it away, then it'd be reinforcement, but presumably the kid likes its toy. For example, if I were to play a really loud sound off these speakers, like it's just a super loud sound and nobody likes it here, and then someone does something good and I take it away, that's negative reinforcement. Because you don't like the sound of that loud sound, someone does something good, I want to reinforce that behavior, and then I take away that loud ringing sound or whatever it is. Yeah, so we try not to use positive and negative to refer to like the toy, the timeout, the Advil. For example, like Advil isn't naturally positive or negative. It's positive in the sense that it makes you feel good because it loses your headache, but it's taking away the headache that's the focus. Like it's hard to explain, but does that make sense? Like, does that clarify it? Perfect, yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so that's what we try not to use it to refer to the stimuli themselves, yeah. Any other questions? Good, right? I don't think I have anything else for today. So that's pretty much all of, that's what I have for my overview of a behavioral psych. It's not, there's actually, I looked, tried to see if there's more in depth I could go, but that's pretty much the premise. When it comes to behavior modification, pretty much all behavior modification, well, pretty much all behavior modification principles are based off of some kind of version of this. Behavior modification is mostly with regards to humans, but you can obviously modify like animal behavior and stuff like that. There's a few other things worth noting that are like evolutionary principles. Like it's hard to train people or animals things that go against their evolution. I don't know if that's relevant to any research that's going on here, but if you have questions about it, let me know. There's a very famous, relatively famous experiment done with monkeys and social learning theory. So monkeys would see a video of other monkeys interacting with butterflies or with snakes. And they would see whether or not those interactions ended well or poorly for the monkeys. So like, it's hard to explain because there's so many monkeys, but a monkey would see another monkey interacting with a butterfly in a good manner, and then they would see a monkey interacting with a butterfly in like a scary manner, like the butterfly attacks the monkey and the monkey's freaking out. So it turns out that monkeys can't learn to fear butterflies based off of observing other monkeys, because there's no reason to like fear a butterfly to begin with. Snakes, however, they can. They can also learn to not fear snakes by seeing other monkeys interact well with a snake, but by seeing other monkeys interact poorly with snakes, they learn to fear snakes. So you can apply this to humans too, for example. Some people are afraid of like birds and butterflies, but let's say I'm not. If I see someone running scared from a butterfly, I may not necessarily learn to fear butterflies. If I'm walking around downtown and I see someone getting attacked by a snake, I'm probably going to start fearing snakes because I have this natural, like, evolutionary disposition to fear snakes. So they could use some other slight variations on this, and that would be one example is evolutionary theory as well. But pretty much all behavior modification principles are based off of this. And you can use this, like, if you really go in depth, you can use this to, like, even explicitly train yourself to do certain things and all that. Yeah.
Do you think there's a generalization for monkey, for example, monkeys can view videos about human interacting with snakes and
You know, that's a good idea. I don't know, that's a good question. I don't know if it's explicitly be done, I don't know off the top of my head. That would boil down to, yeah, so for example, if you do the same study, but also include videos of humans interacting with butterflies and snakes, it would be, yeah, if the monkeys then had the same effects, then it would be generalization. If they didn't, it would be, bless you, it would be discrimination then. They'd be able to distinguish between other monkeys and humans. I don't know off the top of my head, unfortunately.
Yeah, because for human, for example, if I watch a video, a tiger eats a rabbit, I
Yeah.
learn to fear the tiger.
Yeah. Well, I said we also have, as humans, since we have our own like metacognitive ability, we can think about our own thoughts, and we can actually think about us thinking about our own thoughts, which gets really confusing down the rabbit hole. But since we can do that, we're at like a unique advantage about realizing stuff like this. Like a dog isn't going to realize when my dog rings the bells to go outside and I give her a treat for ringing the bells. She's not realizing, oh, I'm being positively reinforced for ringing these bells, so I should do it more often. If they did, then my dog's a genius, but she doesn't. She's not that smart. So it's just like a well-established phenomenon that occurs in animals. It's not like an explicit thing. So with humans, that's an advantage and a disadvantage. For example, let's say I'm trying to train Jiami to do something. If Jiami realizes I'm doing it, then she might stop. But then I can also do it on myself then, no problem, because I'm aware of these principles. For example, my Starbucks and studying, if I want to increase the amount of hours I spend studying, maybe I positively reinforce myself every time I study, which is actually a really good thing to do. It's if ever you're struggling to study, it works well. It's worked well for me, but it's also, if you Google it, one of the things they tell you you do is if you're really dreading going into work, on your way out of work, maybe get a coffee, get yourself a donut, get yourself something you enjoy, like a small little reward, something like that. And it kind of gets you a little bit more motivated to go into work because you know on your way home that you're gonna get that donut, get that coffee, and stuff like that. And that can extend to like clinical applications and everything too.
Or maybe you can train your friend to ring a bell and to get food.
You
And
could.
let your dog watch it.
You could. There's if you guys are familiar with the Big Bang Theory, there's one episode where Sheldon is trying to train. I haven't seen it, so I can't tell you so much about it. But there's an episode where Sheldon is training Penny. He gives her chocolate every time she does something good.
No, the point is let your dog watch it.
Sorry?
Let your dog watch it.
Oh, I don't know if that would work. That's a little, I think, too grand scheme. I don't know how well dogs can learn. I mean, it's possible. Like I've seen videos
Yeah,
online
don't
of.
make the generalization of.
Like it's possible. It's not the most effective method. I would just recommend training the dog to begin with. But you've seen like, I mean, I've seen at least like for example, a human would walk with a limp, and then the dog will imitate the human walking with a limp. So it's possible. I just think it's far more rare. Like, I've never seen my dogs imitate me, for example. They're also pretty small, but yeah, ideally you would just train the dog to do the action you want it to at first. But that would be a mix between social learning theory, right? The dog trying to observe humans, or the
Just
dog
to
trying
study the generalization of dog.
yeah, it's a well-documented phenomenon too that animals learn from each other. It's why when we're trying to like train monkeys, for example, if you put it with a like a responsible alpha male or something, the monkeys are more likely to learn and stay in line because the male or the alpha male will either reinforce but likely punish behaviors that aren't acceptable within that monkey's community. I mean, it applies to humans too. Yeah. Make sense? We're all good?
Yes.
I don't think I have anything else for you guys. I have my email on the front slide too. I can send this around too. I can grab people's emails.
I think we have a notation in our teams, in the lab teams. We can share the slide there.
Yeah, I don't mind at all.
We can share with you and you can put it on.
Yeah, I can show these. They're not. They're yeah.